There was no question of it, that they were the happiest years of his life.
The March of Time. In the year 1941, no privilege is more eagerly sought by many millions of the world's people than asylum in the one nation which for 150 years has been the great and unfailing refuge of the world's oppressed and persecuted peoples. From a dozen once free and democratic nations are coming scholars and artists, doctors and scientists, who have found that the pursuit of wisdom and the practice of the free arts are no longer possible in Nazi Europe. Men of science and men of medicine have been driven from old Vienna. Great men of music have been exiled from their ancient Bohemian city, Prague. Until yesterday, the prospering capital of the newborn Republic of Czechoslovakia. Students and artists have fled from Paris, whose long and unrivaled cultural life and freedom of individual expression has been ended by Nazi conquest. Fleeing imprisonment or death, stripped of all their possessions, hundreds of Europe's men of genius and talent have come to the New World, hoping, like other immigrants, for them to become a part of the life stream of America, to contribute to it new blood, new brains, and their devotion to democracy. Nowhere in the world does the European exile find more sympathy and help than in America.
And he arrived here in October 1940. Of course, he'd come in a convoy, and he'd had to be on deck for the most part of the whole month that it took to cross from England. He had to be on deck in a life jacket most of the time, and I can imagine there was much anxiety and not the best of food. And when I took him off the ship, he wasn't very well. But I took him to a hotel that night, overlooked the United Nations Plaza. There was no United Nations then. And it was very high up, so he could get a splendid view of the whole skyline of Manhattan. And I told him to go to sleep, and when he woke up to call me, I lived a few blocks away, and I came to fetch him to my house for dinner.
I was told of Mondriaan's arrival by Harry Holzman. And Holzman also told us that Mondriaan is a very old man and very tired, and so we couldn't see him for many months until he rested up. Now, since he came to the United States, I think around 1940, he must have met him in the American Abstract Artist meetings around 1941. Pure abstractionists, of course, were in a minority. And to have a great artist come who was very much in sympathy with our movement was a great moral support. I mean, it's hard to imagine how important it was. It was extremely important for us.
Well, he came to the door and opened it for me, and I shook hands with him, and I said I was very happy to meet him, and he looked to me like he might have been a small businessman or something, but suddenly he opened his eyes, and his eyes were not that. And I had that feeling of déjà vu. Have you ever had that? I knew him. That's a very strange thing. It's only happened to me about 3 times. And so he invited me in, and in the room was barren, I thought, and had a few of the white pictures, and I didn't really understand them. But I have a diary somewhere that said when I went out in the street afterwards, the whole city looked different to me, and that was a very extraordinary experience.
What was it, New York, like in the war? I mean, what influence did the war have on New York?
Well, it was a great period for people who were interested in what was being done in the arts, in painting and sculpture, because we had the visit of people like Mondriaan and Max Ernst and so many others who brought foreign influence to us we wouldn't have had otherwise.
And the physical influence of it, did you feel anything in daily life of the war in New York?
Well, the vital, dynamic quality of New York at that time was very clear, and it seemed to affect people like Mondriaan and his contemporaries as something different from Paris or London, or Holland for that matter. And I feel that it was reflected in their work at the time.
So actually the first thing he did in New York was to add these patches of color without lines around.
Yes. Little rectangles of color on the edges, red, blue, yellow. And I think it was the influence of the excitement of New York that created that kind of thing in his mind.
But in those paintings he still used the black lines, right?
Yes.
And that changed too.
That changed, well, it changed to begin with in New York City. I beg your pardon, in New York. He painted one red line. Now, I remember I took Breton to an exhibition that was given by the American abstract artists, and that picture was included in the exhibition that Mondrian exhibited with the American abstract artists in New York. And I said to Breton, what do you think of this picture here with a colored line? It has a red line in it. And Breton, who didn't care very much for Mondrian's paintings, said, La Révolution.
It's dated April 27th, that would be 1942. It said, Dear Mr. Newman, with pleasure I shall meet you for your purpose. I shall be in the afternoon Wednesday and Thursday to your disposition, but Wednesday I have to leave at 4 o'clock. Sincerely yours, Piet Mondriaan.
How were the photo sessions? How did he react to posing?
Well, he remained very much himself, as I remember. You've got to remember that it's almost 40 years since I photographed him. But I do remember he was very stiff, very, very formal, and very polite. We got a very successful sitting, although several of the exposures were ruined because he was hard of hearing and he was playing jazz music quite loud. And every time I'd say, hold it, he'd say, what? So gradually I got used to putting it this way, and then he'd say, oh yes, and then he would hold still.
One time when Mondrian visited us at the apartment, we had several artists over, the artists who were in exile, Duchamp and Ernst, Breton, Léger, and Mondrian came. He came rather late. And he came and looked at the pictures, not at the guests. And he went over to a painting at the far end of the room, and he studied it at great length. And he said, who is this artist? I said, he's a self-taught painter by the name of Hirschfeld. He says, you know, this is the strongest picture in the room.
So that's that picture?
Yes.
How was Mondriaan on social occasions like what you're talking about?
Well, he was quite lively and very attractive to women. And I remember we had a very big divan in the living room there, and by the end of the evening, Mondrian was sitting there surrounded by several girls.
So he wasn't so much of a monk as some people...
He certainly wasn't.
Another rather important piece of historical idiocy is the idea that Mondriaan hated nature. And of course, there are some apocryphal stories around that for people who fail to see Mondriaan's humor. You know, by the time I knew him, he was quite bald and he had thick glasses, and he wasn't a man who he didn't laugh at his own jokes, as it were. There was a famous collector who lived on Park Avenue, right above 57th Street, 2 or 3 blocks above it. And he had Mondriaan to lunch one day, and Mondriaan looked out the window, and looking down at the center strip on Park Avenue, which was planted with shrubbery, he asked this collector how he could bear to live in such a suburban environment. Of course, this was his joke, and his idea was to stimulate the conversation in the direction that he would like it to take. And it wasn't a dislike of nature at all. One has just to read Mondriaan to realize that his understanding of nature and to see his whole development. In his early years, he spent so much time just painting from nature, as it were. And what he was doing, of course, was to differentiate between nature and the naturalistic in painting. And for Mondriaan, of course, the naturalistic was an obstacle to a perception of the reality of the painting.
Well, the first 2 pictures that he painted when he came to America were New York and New York City. New York was, as he said, what the city appeared to him as he approached the city from the boat. And New York City was the city that he was actually living in. Therefore, it was more complex and more developed. He painted this picture completely in color, in colored lines, something he had never done before. He was working with colored tapes. He worked with these tapes in order to save the idea of moving a line slightly this way or that way before he began really painting, so that he would move these things infinitesimally, up or down, sideways, until he found the proper balance, the proper equilibrium, I think he called it.
Most people are put on tape in order to keep the lines straight. But he was not interested in that matter. He was interested in using the tape to make the composition. So he would pull it off or put it back on many times if I sat there for an hour or 2 and say, right, left, meaning where you put it, horizontal, vertical, and I'd say what I thought. And then he would meditate on it a little bit and they'd say, wrong. It's this way, it's the opposite.
Many artists would be afraid to change. It makes them very insecure, but Mondriaan, of course, he was totally brave. And so the style of the colored lines was a new development. There was one trouble, though. If you cut lines of red over blue or yellow, there's a feeling of overlap. And the overlapping creates an illusion of deep space. And so he didn't stay in a style too long because he insisted on flat space. And so in the last 2 paintings, the Boogie Woogie and the Victory Boogie Woogie, at every crossing there would be a rectangle of a different color, which would flatten the space.
And it came in rolls about this big, and the good size was more, and then you could get smaller ones. But the big ones are what, if you used a big picture, you wanted to be able to stretch. But he didn't stretch it to get a straight line. He did it to adjust the red against the green or so on, and for the placement on the plastic space. That's a different matter entirely than trying to get a straight line. His lines were never really straight, if you look close.
Did you buy the tape for him?
Sure, I always bought it for him.
And, but it was wartime, right?
Yeah, it got harder and harder to get. I used to run around to 6 stores, and I'd come triumphant when I got a big one like that.
Blackout notice in New York City, and Mayor LaGuardia personally hands out instruction circulars as America watches the unprecedented experiment. As dusk gathers over Manhattan on this clear spring day, the order is to black out the lower section of the city, affecting 1/4 of the island teeming with millions. Smoothly, efficiently, police, aided by thousands of air raid wardens, clear an area 5 miles square. Amazingly, no traffic accidents, no disturbances are reported. 5,500 street lamps at 2,100 control boxes are turned off. Traffic lights and 3 Brooklyn-Manhattan bridges are switched dark.
Oh, yes, he spent a lot of time making, we were supposed to cover the windows with black curtains, so he bought the kind you pull up and down, you know, they were cheap. And he spent about a week figuring out and putting more black paint on them and fixing it so you couldn't see in.
The fabulous canyons of steel lie in dark repose. 20 minutes of self-imposed darkness penetrated only by the inextinguishable moon and stars. And New York City reports to the nation, blackout 100% successful.
I was looking around, it was during one of my visits one day, and I saw this beautiful little square drawing, worked and reworked and worked, and I was admiring it. And he was such a perfectionist that he said, don't look at it. He said, it's not finished, it's not really good. And almost like you said, I feel like I should throw it out. I said, well, if you're going to throw it out, I would love to have it. But he said, it's not good enough for you. He said, I'll make you another one. So I figured it took him about 3 days to make this second drawing, and he asked me to come back and pick them up because he wanted very much to give me something. And he looked at it, and he said, you know, this gives me an idea of something that's going on in my head. He said, would you make a photograph of the second drawing for me? And I did. And according to everyone, all the experts and so on, the timing of it, the stylistic content, there's no question that he went on to make Broadway Boogie Woogie from these 2 drawings.
And I had the pleasure of introducing him that night to the first discs he heard of the real boogie-woogie music. And his reaction, as I anticipated, was absolutely astonishing. He just put his hands together and said, enormous, enormous, enormous. environment itself was for him the experiment of his self, so to speak. And so, as you can see in his studio, it is almost as pure as his painting. And you'll note in his bedroom study, the desk and stool were made from a packing case that contained some paintings returned to him from an exhibition. And in the background, you'll see two orange crates, which are linked together with horizontal strips modified with color, which became his bookcases. It wasn't that he couldn't afford to buy anything. It was simply that he wanted the forms of these objects to be consonant with his concept of the interior environment that he was creating. He's a great admirer of the work of Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. He never wanted to miss a film of theirs.
What did he admire in them?
The dancing, and of course, Astaire particularly, Mondriaan's own form of dance that he liked to, well, I never saw him perform too much, but he was fairly old, but he still liked to dance right to the end, you know. He was nearly 72 when he died, and he liked to dance right to the end. He called it vertical dancing.
He introduced, which now is popular, and which I don't like. You kept your partner this distance from you when you danced. Well, that'd never been done before. You felt a little bit loose, peculiar. And now they all do this, because when I see them getting up and doing the, what is it, the disco or whatever they do, they're all dancing by themselves in front of somebody else.
What did he like to dance to?
He liked boogie woogie was the style. That's why he named this boogie woogie.
Well, in the boogie woogie, you have the annihilation of the melodic. So you have the free, harmonic, in balance with and never dominating the rhythmic.
He didn't like melody, no. He liked the rhythm. Rhythm is different than melody. When it was soft and melodic, he stopped. It's part of the fact that its romanticism is also the same to him. Romantic painting would be the same as the melodic. He stopped dancing, just stood and sat down.
He had some friends, but I haven't seen any other women friends around him.
No, he didn't have him. Sometimes he didn't want some very famous men. He closed the door once on Waren, the great composer, who was a friend of mine for years, came to see him. When he didn't want anybody, he just shoved him out. So
how come he wanted you to be around?
I don't know. He wanted me. I was sort of something I could echo him, how should we say. I mean, I could pick up what he had to say and echo it back. It wasn't, he was extremely, I don't mean that he was extremely, he could have been a monk, you know? Not that he didn't like women, but he never knew how to deal with them.
How come?
I don't know. I think it was that father of his was very difficult to deal with, and that the intense pursuit of an artist, you know, who lives between Earth and heaven, he has a little room for women, unless they're useful. I was in love with him, really, but I mean, it wasn't that kind of a love. And secondly, it would never do. I never had any illusions it would ever do. Once he said, you ought to come up here and live near me, but I never did.
He was actually much more of a success in New York than he'd ever been in his life.
I don't know if one can say that he was more of a success, maybe economically, and perhaps there was the increasing interest in his work here, and he had a much larger group of artists who were vitally concerned with the evolution and development of abstract art at that time. And of course, when he began to show here, his work began to sell.
And he had his first one.
He had his first, so far as I know, certainly in the development of his major work, he had his first one-man shows in this country.
Valentine Dudensing had a gallery on 57th Street, and he gave a half of an exhibition to Mondriaan, and the other half to a Brazilian lady by the name of Maria Martins. She was a sculptor. At the end of the exhibition, there were only a few Mondriaans in the show. At the end of the exhibition, Maria Martins, the sculptor, bought Broadway Boogie Woogie. And I happened in the gallery the same day, and the proprietor, Valentine, said to me, I just sold Broadway Boogie Woogie for $600 and it's worth $6,000. Maria Martins gave the picture to the Museum of Modern Art, and today I think it has a value slightly above what Valentine estimated at that time.
We were going down to see the exhibition before it closed, and we asked Mondriaan if he would join us for cocktails because Fernand Léger was here, and I knew that they knew each other and liked each other. And he said he would if he could come a half an hour earlier than the party. We didn't know what that meant, but he arrived with a tin of paint, a brush, and some wire and nails and a hammer, and a picture, which is this picture. He said, this is for you, if I can put it where I want to put it, in your apartment, and leave it there. And it was put here where it is now, and was left here.
And what was hanging there before?
It was a big painting by Fernand Léger. It was his party, in a sense. So we explained this to Mondriaan, and he said, oh, well, Léger won't mind, because there was another right round the corner, as you can see from here.
The whole apartment is still the same as it was then?
Same furniture, same. The only difference, we had straw matting, Chinese straw matting on the floor.
So I told him once, you know, I made a little sketch of what we were talking about last time. He took a laugh at it and he had a fit. And he said, well, you really shouldn't have done it, but okay. And so I took it home and never said a word again about it.
But what is it? What is the sketch of?
It's it's a boogie woogie.
In the very first
Not the first.
stage.
He'd already done a lot of work over there, but he did the final work in 59th Street when he began to put the squares on, you know. And I said to him, you know, you're breaking your theory. He said, my theory, I make my theory as I go along, and I break it if it's necessary.
Victory Boogie Woogie I saw just before the end of 1943. I saw the picture at his studio in what he thought was a completed state. And it was on an easel in the back of his studio, and he asked me what I thought of the picture, and I thought it was great. You know, I was really floored by it. And later on he said, don't you think that it needs a little attention here? And he pointed to the lower right-hand side. I said, I don't think you can move a line. I think it's absolutely perfect. And he kept coming back to that area, but he said nothing, and I left. 2 months later, I got a wire from Alfred Barr that Mondriaan had died, and I was certainly heartbroken about it. I couldn't get back to New York for the funeral. When I saw the picture a few months later, it had been completely changed. He had added tapes, and today it's in that unfinished state.
During one of my visits to Mondriaan, he was telling me about his search for peace, the fact that it was so difficult for him that he could only paint and work in peace. He was an old man, and that he had to leave Paris and flee Paris to go to England to find peace, and then the war caught up with him there, and now he has come to America, and he says, here I hope I will find peace. And it is so dramatic, and it is so unusual in the timing that people think I've dreamt the story up, but it actually happened. It's one of the eeriest stories of my life. As he said, now I am here in New York, and I hope to find peace. The building began to rumble, literally shake. And we rushed over to the window and we looked down. What it was Memorial Day, 1942.
America at war. In New York, masked flags leading 500,000 marchers in the greatest patriotic and military demonstration ever seen in this or any country. Tanks, mechanized equipment to give New Yorkers a sample of the weapons it takes to fight a modern war. For miles, for hours, even into the night they march. Workers in armament industries joining the procession. The home front organized for war. All America on the march, flying the battle flag that has never known defeat.
Here we saw all these signs of war going past his very door, and he looked at me and the most resigned, helpless shrug went this way, you know. War had caught up with him again, and there was no peace.
This is the same office which I have occupied for about 49 years. Mr. Mondriaan would come into that room, the waiting room, then into this room briefly, but mostly into the examining room. And things have not changed in that character. I knew that something about what he was drawing, but I didn't have any real appreciation of its merit. And when I went over to his studio and saw what was on the frames, I thought, well, these are lines and squares and it's simple artistic work and about what I would expect from such an individual as I judged him to be, the kindly, unsophisticated gentleman.
How did he behave about it?
Well, he was very quiet and very shy and very unassuming and almost childlike in his attitudes. And there were such minor disorders about which he complained that you would hardly think somebody would bring that to the physician's attention.
But he paid it.
So he emphasized it, and he was satisfied when I reassured him. And I don't think I ever found any serious illness before his the final one.
I had seen him on a Friday. He'd come down to my place. We went for dinner. And the following Monday, I ran into an artist who had visited him the day before, and he told me that Mondriaan had a very bad cold. And I decided that the next day I would go to visit him to see how he was. And when I came there, he had a raging fever.
He was in bed?
He was in bed, but still walking around, I mean, if he had to. But he had a very high fever, and I immediately called his doctor.
And I ran over there. It was not far from here in the 50s. The studio was very cold. He was probably very undernourished. He was always somewhat thin anyway. Sitting in the cold studio, very short of breath and coughing. Listened to his chest, and he obviously had an extensive involvement of his lung. That is, the breath sounds came through loud with noises, and he had a lobar pneumonia. So we moved him to a hospital. At that time, it was a small hospital called the Murray Hill Hospital, which is on East 40th Street, and subsequently is closed. I knew Mr. Mondriaan was an artist of merit, but I didn't know his great prominence. Mr. Holtzman called me and then said, this man's his reputation is international, and you better get the very best consultant available because he looks pretty sick and he may not survive.
Oh, he had a very fine doctor. I insisted that the doctor get a specialist. The specialist came and could do no more but to approve what the doctor was doing. Mondriaan was nearly 72.
Well, I was called about 2:30 or 3 o'clock in the morning and asked to go to the hospital. And I found it a little difficult to get to the hospital. At that time, there wasn't a taxi around this part of the town. And when I got there, he was rather feeble. I mean, I thought it was pretty near the end, and I spoke to him a little while, and then he asked me if I had a pencil and some paper, and he seemed to have difficulty speaking, so he said he wanted to write, or he indicated he wanted to write a message, and he wrote this message, and then he fell over. He was tired and couldn't do much about it. He handed me the paper, which I still have. And I often wondered what this message was that he said he wanted me to have because he felt he was very ill.
You can't read it.
I can't read, but I was just wondering what was troubling him so much in his last hours there. Maybe nothing at all. I hope nothing.
There was a ceremony of sorts at the funeral home, and the consul, the Dutch consul came, and Alfred Barr of the Museum of Modern Art gave a peroration, and then a group of us, which included Léger and other artists who were very sympathetic to Mondriaan, came to the cemetery.
And Elion, who just escaped from a German war camp, came to the United States, and since he was the oldest friend of Mondriaan, and at one time his follower in style, he was pushed forward to speak as a follower of neoplasticism. But since then, Elion had become a realist. And so there he had a dilemma. He could not speak as a follower of neoplasticism because he wasn't. It would have been a lie. He couldn't very well refuse to speak for a friend, but still it would have been on false grounds. And so he was numb, he could not speak. The poor man stood there, and he stood there, and he finally walked away, very sad.
I think I could add here that Mondriaan lived a very luxurious life. I don't know how one could have a more sane and complete life than a person who has succeeded in having an identity between his inner life and his outer life. And this was the great luxury of his whole existence from the time he left home and began his career as an artist. He lived his belief, and he lived this with enormous continuity and concentration.
The first aim in a painting should be universal expression. what is needed in a picture to realize this is an equivalent of vertical and horizontal expressions. Many appreciate in my former work what I did not want to express, but which was produced by an incapacity to express what I wanted to express, dynamic movement in equilibrium. This is what I am attempting in Victory, Boogie Woogie. The attitude of the Cubists to the representations of volume and space was contrary to my conception of abstraction, which is based on the belief that this very space has to be destroyed. As a consequence, I came to the destruction of volume by the use of the plane. This I accomplished by means of lines cutting the planes, but still the plane remained too intact. So I came to making only lines, and I brought the color within the lines. Now the only problem was to destroy these lines also through mutual oppositions. I think the destructive element is too much neglected in art.